Hi, this is Tom Does Tech. I'm Tom, and in this video, we're going to be building a GraphQL API with NestJS. So who is this video for? This video is for those that are already familiar with what NestJS is, those familiar with some GraphQL concepts, and those familiar with TypeScript. What does this video not cover? We're not going to be using a MongoDB database connection or a REST API data source connection. The reason I'm not going to include those is because I don't want to make any assumptions about what data source you're using. You could be using MongoDB, you could be using Postgres, or you could be getting your data from a REST API. If you could please leave a comment in the comment section down below and tell me what you would like part 2 to be on. If you would like me to use MongoDB or a REST API or Postgres, please let me know. So I'm over here in the GraphQL playground that comes with Apollo server. And this is the API that we're going to be building. You can see here that you can get a list of books and you can get a list of authors. You can create a single book and you can find a single book. This API is pretty simple, but it's going to give you the building blocks for you to build out a more complicated API if you want to do that. So if you want to build this API with me, stick around and let's get building. Before we get started, we'll take a quick look at the code that we're going to build out. So with all NestJS applications, we start with the main.ts file, and this is just going to bootstrap our application. I've changed my default port to port 5000. And then we move on to the app.module, and this is where our GraphQL module is imported. And we're going to use auto schema file and output the schema to this schema.gql. And you can see that schema that has been output here. And then we have our book and author modules. We also have our data folder, and this just includes 2 data files, an authors file and a books file. In our books file, we have our book module. Inside the book module, we provide 3 providers: the book resolver, book service, and the author service. The most interesting file in here is the book resolver. And because we're using TypeGraphQL, we're going to see these annotations above our functions. So this just says that we're going to use a query, and the query is going to return an array of books. Down here we have another query that is going to return a single book. Down here we have a mutation for creating a book. And then we have a resolver field for attaching the author to a book. The book service is where the actual data comes from. So a service is used for manipulating and fetching our data. So you can see here we have a function for finding many books. We have a function for finding a book by an ID, find a book by an author ID, and one for creating a book. The author folder is going to look much similar to the book folder. So we have an author resolver, we have an author schema, we have an author service, and then it's all tied together in the author module. I'm here in a new directory, and if you haven't already, you need to install the Nest CLI globally. Once you've installed the CLI, you can create your new project with Nest New. I'm going to call mine part 1. But you can call yours whatever you like. You'll need to select the package manager that you would like to use. I'm going to use Yarn. After you've finished bootstrapping your application, we're going to install some dependencies. So we're going to install @nestjs/GraphQL, GraphQL tools, GraphQL, and Apollo Server Express. The first module that we're going to create is the author module. So you can use the Nest CLI to start building out those components. So we can use NestG, which stands for generate, module author. And this will create the author folder. In the author folder, we'll have the author module included. And then if we have a look at our app module, you can see here that it imports the author module. So we can do the same to create a resolver. So we say NestG resolver author, and this will create a resolver in the author folder. We can do the same with a service. And then finally, we're just going to touch a author.schema.ts file. And you can see that file just here. So let's bootstrap the same for our book module. So we'll say NestG module book, the NestG resolver book, Nest generate service book. And again, we'll just touch our book schema. I have these 2 data files here that I'm just going to paste into the source directory. And so these are our authors file and our books file. And the relationship between these is a book will reference an author by its ID. So you can see here, the author of this book is 1. And 1 we can see is J.K. Rowling. So let's start building our book components. So I'm going to work backwards here. So I'm going to start at the service, as that's the lowest level component. And then I'm going to work up to the resolver. And then finally, what we need to do on the module. So our service is going to have 4 functions. It's going to have a find many function. It's going to have a find by ID function. And the find by ID function is going to take an ID as an argument. It's going to have a find by author ID function. And it's going to have a create book function. The create book function is going to take a book, and this is going to be of type create book input. And we're going to have to build out this type here. The find by author ID is going to take an author ID. So we can import our books, and our find many function is just going to return books. The find by ID function is going to return a filtered list of books. And then if we have books in this array, we're just going to return the 0th element of the books array. If not, we're going to return null. And we can see here this says this.books. So I'm going to put books into the constructor, and books here doesn't exist on the type book service. So we can say up here that books is a type of partial, and it's going to be a book type. And we still need to build this book type. And then our find many can just return this.books. And our find by author function is going to return a filtered list of books that are filtered by the author's ID. Finally, the create book function is going to make this.books equal to a new array with our book input at the first element of the array. And it's just going to return the book that was passed in. So let's go ahead and create this create book function and our book object. Let's come over to book schema. And we're going to create an object type, and this here is a decorator that comes from the NestJS GraphQL package, and it needs to have an @ symbol. And we're going to export a class of book, and our book is going to have a ID, a title, an ISBN, and an author. So this field also comes from NestJS/GraphQL, and so we can put that in here, and so does ID. And we're going to also need to create this author type. Firstly, let's create this create book input. So this is of type input type, also comes from NestJS GraphQL. All these types here, if you're familiar with type GraphQL, they're going to look very familiar. That's because NestJS/GraphQL imports types and decorators from type GraphQL. And we need to import our int. We're also going to need an input type for finding a book, and this just takes an ID. Let's import these types into our service. We've got book, and we've got create book input. And our books array should be our books object should be an array. And this looks good. So the only error we have here is our author object. So let's quickly jump into author, and we can create that. So open up author.schema, and we can import our object type, field, and ID from GraphQL. And we also need to import our book type. And you can see here that this is referring to the GraphQL type. And then this here is going to refer to the TypeScript type. So ID is different to a string, but in GraphQL, this is going to tell it that it's an ID. And then when we use the types in TypeScript, it's just going to be a string. Let's try start our application. And I'm just going to change my start command to yarn dev, so I don't have to type start dev. I'm also going to change the default port to port 5000. So we have a few errors here, and that's because we haven't actually imported author into our book schema. So we can get VS Code to find that for us and do the import. We'll do a restart here, and you can see our application has started successfully. So before we get too far, let's do our GraphQL setup. So if you open up app.module, you can import the GraphQL module from NestJS/GraphQL. And in our imports, we're going to need to use this GraphQL module .for root. And then for root takes an object. And we're going to put in one argument, and that is auto schema file, and then just the path to a file. And it looks like we're getting an error here because the root query cannot be provided. And that is because in our resolvers, we have no queries. So let's jump back into our book resolver, and we can start building out a query in here. So the first query we're going to build is our books. So this is going to return an array of books. So we need to import query from GraphQL. So query should come from NestJS/GraphQL, not NestJS/common. We need to import our book type, and we need to define our book service. So we do that in a constructor. So our constructor trait takes a private object called book service, and it's of type book service. And we can import that here. So now we can say this.bookservice.findMany, and we're going to return the result of that for our books query. So you can see here that we have a definition of what the query will return. We have a definition of what the query will return. We have the name of the query, and we have how the query will be resolved. So in here, we could just say return an empty array, and we would return an empty array, but we want to return the result of this function. And you can see here that our GraphQL server is now running. So if we come into our GraphQL playground, we can run our books query, and it says cannot return null for field author.id. And this is because we have an author object here, but in our books array, author is just an ID. So we need to create a resolver to resolve this author. So let's come back into our book resolver. And to do this, we're going to create a resolve field. And it's these resolve fields that make GraphQL a graph. So this resolve field is going to return an author. It's going to use this parent decorator to populate our book. And then from there, we can use our book to return the result of our find by ID in our book service that we still need to build out. So let's import parent from NestJS/GraphQL. And we also need to create this book service. So we can do the same here where we say private author service, and that's of type author service. And so we need to create this find by ID function on the author service. So if we jump over into here, we can create a function that says async find by ID, and it's going to take an ID. We need to import our authors. And like we did with the query to find a single book, we're just going to say if the result has a length, then return the 0th element in the result, otherwise return null. So if we come back to our book resolver, you can see that we have no more errors here, and our GraphQL server should start correctly, except we need to import our book service into our, we need to import our author service into our book module. And when people talk about NestJS and the boilerplate and call it Angular for Node, this is what they're talking about. There's a lot of peer dependencies all over the place. So in here we can say author service, and that should keep NestJS happy. So we have an undefined resolver type error. Make sure you're providing an explicit object type for book resolver. So if we come back into Book Resolver, you can see here that we're not providing an explicit type. And we need to do this because we have a resolver field on here. So this worked up until the point where we use this resolver field. But now that we have this, we need to tell it that this resolver is for returning books. And our GraphQL server is started. So if we come back to the GraphQL playground, we can run this query and we now get our books and our author objects are populated. So let's move on to our author query where we're going to return an array of authors. So open up the author resolver. And just like the book service, we're going to have two private functions here. We're going to have our author service and our book service. And we can import those. And you guessed it, on our author module, we're going to need to provide our book service. So we have a query here of authors that's going to return an array of authors. And to do that, it's going to call this.authorservice.findMany. So we need to import the query from NestJS/GraphQL. We need to import our author type. And we need to implement this findMany function. So we're going to say async findMany. It's just going to return authors. We come back to our GraphQL playground. You can see that we're requesting an array of authors. And it looks like here we're going to resolve a book. So let's run this query and see what it says. Cannot return null for type of author.books. So let's add a resolver field here like we did for the books.author. So we need to import this resolve field from NestJS/GraphQL. And we also need to import parent. And this is going to return the result of bookservice.findByAuthorID. And again, because we're using this resolve field here, we need to tell TypeGraphQL that this resolver here is for our type of author. So we come back to the GraphQL playground and we can run this query. And it looks good. So let's implement our create book mutation. So come back to our book resolver. So we're going to have a mutation here that's going to return a type of book. It's going to take some arguments and we're going to call the arguments input, and I'll explain why we do this. You can just leave this blank if you like, but I highly recommend you create an argument called input. And the input is going to take a type of book that is going to be type of create book input. And then it's going to return the result of this.bookservice.createBook. So let's import all these decorators and the create book type from our book schema. So if we come back to our GraphQL playground, you can see our mutation here. And if we run that, it's going to create a new book. And the reason that I say that you should use the input type is because you can assign this input here to a variable. So if you don't use the input type, you're going to have to put all your properties in here. So you're going to have to use ID, and then that's going to be a type of ID. And then you have ISBN, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as you go to add or remove a property in here, you are going to need to add it to every implementation of this mutation. And you don't want to have to do that. You just want to be able to create this mutation. And then every time you use it, you just add your new property to the usage. And by creating this input variable, it allows you to do that. So let's move on to our final query to find a single book. So come back to our book resolver. And we're going to create a query that is going to return a book. And the query is going to be called book. And we're going to do that by passing in an ID. And we're going to use our find book input. So we can import this type here. And this is now implemented. So we can run this query here, and you can see we get our book back. So there's a lot of boilerplate that goes into a TypeGraphQL implementation, and especially in a NestJS implementation. But you can see by this last query here, once you get all that boilerplate in, implementing new queries is really fast. Without TypeGraphQL, to create a query, you need to create the resolver, and then you need to create the query in the schema, where this does it all for you. So that concludes the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.